Hi and welcome to another Rank Success podcast on the topic of police promotion, and I am accompanied again. My guest today is Simon Foy. So this is the third time Simon's been kind enough to share some food for thought and reflection for the benefit of promotion candidates and anybody that's listening to this podcast. Welcome, Simon. Our
Steve,
paths have crossed again.
It's as ever a pleasure to be back. You give me the undoubted gift and privilege of being able to babble along and talk totally uninterrupted. Some may say it's a load of nonsense, but actually it's a really good opportunity just to think aloud. But it's great to be here.
Okay, and I'm grateful for your time, and I know we're both dashing off after this one. We were dashing on a train last time, and we're dashing off on trains again after this. So what I want to talk about is that the last time, since we spoke, there have been a couple of developments in policing, and one of those is the recent publication of the Strategic Policing Review Report. So it's a strategic review of policing in England and Wales by the Police Foundation, Sir Michael Barber, and they are focused on a crisis in policing. It's one of the most comprehensive pieces of review of policing recently, and it's got three challenges there initially. That the police face a capacity challenge. So the range and complexity of public safety demand, there's no way that the police on their own are able to tackle it. The police face a capability challenge. It's not just that the police lack sufficient resources to tackle these challenges, but also that the police service lacks many of the capabilities required to do so. And the police face an organisational challenge in that the police service needs a different organisational platform so it can deliver the capabilities required to meet the challenges that they describe in the report. Now, the report is 200 pages. There are 56 recommendations. Clearly, we're not going to get a chance to cover all of those. But Sir Robert Peel, who you alluded to previously, is cited, and his words, "The time has come." So the time has come for reform. I know you've read that report. What I wanted to do today was, first and foremost, on 3 points, just capture some of your initial thoughts, ideas and reflections from having read it. It is a big piece of work, and I know that even the Police Foundation are still, unsurprisingly, going to be going around various organisations and police forces to get feedback and seeking feedback on their report. The second thing I want to talk about is just obviously in relation to police promotion candidates, the value that this may provide for them as part of their wider preparation for promotion selection processes and boards. And the third bit was just to talk around some of the aspects of initial police training. So I know you're involved in that. So those are the three areas I wanted to cover. So the first one really is, having read it, for the benefit of listeners, what are some of your thoughts and ideas and reflections?
I mean, there's a number of reactions to this, Steve. When you read through this report, when you read through other reports that have been written, not quite in as much depth or a similar vein, or maybe not have been written that when Michael Barber's right, policing is at this very, very strange place where it's caught between a load of demands in terms of it's becoming increasingly difficult to deliver the policing model that Robert Peel envisaged. And, at that critical point, Michael Barber has attempted to run through the landscape and the scenario and set out him and his group's view about some of the ways to fix it and actually move things on. So from its very simple point of view, it is clearly a report that's been thought about by some people who, they're not just clever people, but they're people who clearly think deeply about policing and care about policing and want to do the best for policing. And they've got together to share their collective thoughts and try and articulate their concerns in a relative coherent narrative. I mean, that sounds like a horrible phrase, but they want to try and express what is quite a complicated subject in a relatively easy to read and easy to understand way which is expressed in a way that is evidence-based and has a bit of critical analysis in there, which is relatively robust. And then, having gone through all that, then produce a series of recommendations which say, if you do this, in our view, then you'll fix some of these problems. So from the point of view of being a report, it's a fascinating read. I thought it was really quite articulate about the cusp that policing faces in terms of the modern world. So there's lots of stuff in there about cyber-enabled crime. There's lots of stuff in there about whether the current 43 police force structure is actually capable of delivering against organised and serious crime. What's the place and role of the regional units? Is there some benefit in getting the funding around those units absolutely clear, so there's no real bartering and negotiation about what their terms of reference are? There's some really interesting stuff about how can you centralize some of the thinking on crime prevention. How can you get more centralized direction in terms of policing, how policing moves? It's very strong in we need to keep the footprint in the neighborhood. It makes some interesting observations about what the next iteration of police crime commissioners might look like. And I also think, and this is probably where we're probably going to end up, it muses about whether leadership in the police services is match fit at the moment, and how it can reinforce and make more robust some of the leadership to steer the service through the current crisis. So for anybody who's interested in policing, it is a well-written, thought-through, evidence-based, articulate analysis of what's going on. Of course, there's a couple of things that I balk at. I'm disappointed at the lack of detail around how it, for instance, fixes the issue around detectives. I think some of the solutions around that are just oversimplistic. I'm really disappointed by the disguised curiosity around maybe we should take away independent chairs of police misconduct proceedings, and that would help us get better results. In fact, I absolutely balk at that, because that just seems to me utter madness. The whole point of having a body of independent people was ostensibly to make it more fair and visible and reasonable. So if it's not going your way, and these things are being hard to prove, so the answer is just to change some of the transparency around it. That just is nonsensical to me, and I can't express myself more strongly around it. And of course, it always comes down to there's these things take a lot of time, they take a lot of money, they take a lot of political courage, they take legislation, they take great efforts to persuade people that this is the right thing to do. And of course, the two biggest things I don't think it does address particularly well, in my view, is it doesn't really sort of articulate and hang on to Peel's principle of policing by consent. I think it attempts to try and actually get a more efficient centralized structure to deliver what in their terms is policing by consent. But as we all know, policing consent is slightly muddled and messy. That's what makes it unique, in the sense that how we deliver what we deliver with the consent of the public is never been a particularly clear science. And I'm not at all sure that a collection of centralizations and efficiencies and trying to look at things through a more, in their world, match fit way is going to make something that's always going to be a bit muddled any clearer. and there's some interesting stuff around there about some odd things about how they can make this sort of seeming inevitable challenge about getting police forces to look like the communities they serve, and using the words positive discrimination to try and achieve this. That's sort of what it's come to now. That is so hard to do, and despite everybody's just efforts, it's not working as well as it should. Well, that's because it's difficult. And saying that we're just introduce a new principle of law or acceptable breaches of the law to make it happen, it strikes me as a little bit flimsy. Because it's trying to wrestle with the hardest snake of all, which is how does policing come across to the public in a way that allows us to keep our treasure, which they actually think we are bound to keep, of policing by consent. So it's a sort of mixed bag for me. Lots of good stuff. I really enjoyed reading it. It's very interesting. It's very useful. It's maybe leading sort of smoothly into your second question. It's an absolute must for anybody who's trying to develop a view and opinion about police and policing. Anybody who has an interest in policing should read this. But this isn't everybody's cup of tea to plough your way through this type of document. Anybody who's got any sort of responsibility for leadership in the police service, it's compulsory. That's what you pay the extra money to do. You've got to read this, and you've got to understand it, and you've got to synthesize it, and you've got to listen to the views, and you've got to read the mood music around it and understand where it's going to go. So there's something in between the two. Somebody who's interested in policing and someone who has an overall accountability or responsible for leadership. Somewhere in between the two is I imagine some of your clients and people who work with you who want to make their way in the world as future police leaders. And so, it's like a lot of these reports and documents, Steve, they come out and we say to people, you should read it. But this one you should, really, because, at the very least, if you're a candidate for a promotion process, and you're sitting in front of somebody who is looking for you to demonstrate the competency of understanding the environment around you, knowing what you have to do as a police leader to make things happen, recognizing your responsibilities in a new world, thinking about what additional skills and competencies you may have. This gives you all sorts of clues and opportunities to try and articulate some of that. And the second and very narrow thing to say is that this is the type of report that you ought to have an opinion on. Because if you have an opinion on it, you can have a completely different opinion to me. But if you have an opinion to it, well, that just shows something. It shows, A, that you're interested, B, that you've thought about it, and most crucially of all, especially if you come up with this, and this is what I think it means, and this is what I think its implications is for me in the role or rank that I'm aspiring to, that's a really good demonstrator of your competence as a future leader. And it'll be something that I think will be a sort of, if you answer a question about this well, I think that's a big tick in the box.
And I think there's a lot of there is a lot of information in that report. So there's a whole section in there on strengthening police leadership and a recommendation that all promotion and selection processes ought to be reviewed. There's a high degree of dissatisfaction in relation to those, and it would benefit from greater regulation by the College of Policing. So there's also a whole load of stuff in there, right from a dearth of applications for chief constables positions and senior leaderships, criticisms around the culture of CPD, people driving their own development, opportunities for that time, dedicated time being provided for that. But there's a lot of information for officers to read in terms of promotion selection processes for effective preparation. So this one I kind of caught hot off the press when it was done. There was also a WeCops debate, which is a virtual Twitter debate, and that was good. And I know there'll be lots of conversations around this, but I'm grateful to you for that observation around the fact that, you know, as a police promotion candidate, you can't really not read this. There's so much in there to help shape your views and opinions, and to put you match fit to apply in a promotion process and to come across well in an interview, because there's so much in there. But I think this report is comprehensive in relation to what the future might look like. So from that perspective, I think people need to read it. But I was quite intrigued in what you thought about is effectively a recommendation for a complete revamp of processes, selection processes.
Yeah. Well, I think in my view, this whole and in the world according to this report, and, you know, I've made the point, there's bits I agree with it, the bits I don't. And, you know, I think that'll be universal. Some people will agree with it, and some they don't. But in the world according to this report, and you always have to accept the fact that this is being done for a reason, and it's been written, in my humble opinion, with a couple of things which potentially could be in mind for the direction the present government wants to go, but that's probably, you know, that's probably not entirely fair, but I have a strong suspicion it might be true. Right at its core is this, I don't know if you saw it, but this certificate of competence. So the certificate to practice. It's a sort of interesting issue which nibbles around the edges of the sense that these, you know, there's some, one of the opinions they express is that in order to get better public confidence, police have to behave better. I mean, I still have no idea what better looks like, but anyway, they still have to behave better. And one of the ways of reinforcing that is to have the certificate of competence. So every 5 years, you have to demonstrate your competence, and, you know, you have to display all this sort of stuff, and you have to show you've developed yourself. It's a pragmatic idea. Practically, it's going to be really hard to do. I think it'll go back into, you know, I think there'll be a whole contractual negotiation that goes with it. So, you know, are you just getting a renewal of a contract for 5 years? Is that what it means? I think it talks loosely about, if you don't meet the certificate of competence, then you receive further training. But like all of these things, it doesn't say, well, what happens after that if you still, in the eyes of somebody, don't have a fitness to practice? Do you get sacked? Do you get dismissed? Do you leave? Does your contract? Do you get, and so that points towards, and I will answer your question about leadership and training, because it is relevant, but that points towards a strong belief, perhaps from this document, that there's something in here which says we ultimately abandon the pure vocational nature of this proud profession that you and I have been part of, i.e. we join because, you know, we want to, you know, serve the public and all that sort of stuff, and you replace it with a series of contractual negotiations every 5 years about whether you're judged as being fit to practice or not. So that's quite a significant, major recommendation. Now, where this leads back into what you were saying is, in the logic of this report, you can't have that centralized certificate of practice without having a really strong regulation which puts in place a series of consistent standards across all forces, so that everybody is able to know what exactly it is they have to do to get this certificate of practice. And the way that you achieve that is through some drawing back of the, into the center, again, whatever that means. I think there's a recommendation around, buttressing up the College of Policing and creating some sort of central leadership college, and giving that central authority a much stronger remit to do two things really. One, to set the standards that people should aspire to, and then to have a role, and I didn't quite understand what the specific role would be, but to have a role in ensuring that there was compliance to that standard. So, is this new centralized authority going to sign off every certificate of competence? What is going to be the governance and regulation around that? I mean, lots and huge amounts of detail. But the point I'm making, Steve, probably long-windedly, is that if you're going to achieve some of this stuff, you're going to have a more centralized role in setting the standards for development, training, promotion, leadership, all that sort of stuff. They're going to have to be based on something which allows people to say, that's what I got to do, whether I'm in from one end of the country to the other, that's what I got to do. I know that. Because if I don't do that, then I won't get my certificate and I won't be able to continue working. That's sort of what it comes down to. So you have to have a really rigorous standard that people can aspire to. And I think that's where all the regulations around centralized leadership training, centralized standards, etc., seems to come from. It's almost to support this idea and this concept. And again, I'm deeply unconvinced by this, but they seem to think it's a good idea. But this idea that the way that you perhaps make police behave and perform for this new modern world is you regulate it by a certificate to practice. So you have to create all this stuff to support the ability to discharge what you have to do to demonstrate that. That makes sense?
Yeah, it does. Yeah, and thanks very much for kind of going through that. And I know that we've got a limited amount of time, so I just wanted to kind of move on quickly. I hope that's been useful for listeners to tune in and reflect on that. But the third point was there's also observations in there under the learning and development section around initial police training and the entry routes, and their observation is that it's too soon to come to any conclusions at the moment as to the impact of the new entry routes, and they certainly don't have the space in that report to undertake any evaluation of it, but they do support the principle that police officers should have access to higher learning, but applicants should not need a degree to join the police, as it would exclude many excellent candidates. I know that you're involved at the moment with supporting new police recruits, so just want to comment on that. Why not?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's part of the sort of sort of almost Jekyll and Hyde nature of this report, really, that it really flops around the edges about making some comment about whether this degree-led entry is a good thing or a bad thing. Yes, it is far too early to say. Absolutely, I get that. And I get their sort of slightly timid, well, actually, but it's a really good thing that officers are being exposed to thinking in greater depth and all that sort of stuff. And they rather, in my mind, timidly say, but there's a risk, as a lot of us said, that by making it degree-led, while you'll get a really good quality candidate, and I'll come back to the candidates that I've actually had sight of and some good things about it, but it does potentially rule out the pure vocationalists, if I could use that phrase. There's a bunch of people who aren't in that mindset, that route, who will, till the day I draw my last breath, I will believe that they will be, some of them will be fantastic cops because they're equipped with a whole load of other stuff, which, and I mean to say this with total respect, intellectual horsepower, isn't everything. It's a lot, but it isn't everything. And it's a real shame and remains a real tragedy that some of those folks are going to be excluded by this deliberate choice, and it's a political choice around graduate-led entry. Just going back a little bit to the graduate-led entry thing, Steve, just to I do desperately try and answer your questions, although often I go on some sort of ramble. But you're right. My experience at the moment is to be doing a bit of work with one of the 4 universities in London that's supporting the DHEP and the PCDA. And I've been working actually with real live constables who have come back into university on week 36 of their service, and the bit we're dealing with them is sort of leadership, not leadership, is investigation and safeguarding. I have to say it's done a couple of things really. One, it's reinforced my faith in frontline cops. Not that I ever needed any reinforcement, but we all get a bit sort of weighed down by all this horrendous, in my mind, totally unfair and entirely selective nibbling away at the competence of cops by virtue of horror stories, which we're all horrified by, but sort of creates the impression that everybody's like that, which is so not true. I was so just generally refreshed to see 2 things. One, to see relatively almost brand new cops wrestling with their really strong desire to do their best for people. I get this, hugely frustrated by the fact that the organisation was so clunky that they couldn't sometimes do their job, that they were already beginning to sense that they were getting crowded out from, they just were bouncing from thing to thing and not really getting a chance to do anything properly, and expressing frustration that they at times couldn't provide the service that they'd like to do. Yeah, I get all that, and I suspect it's probably in every other force in the country. But actually, what I heard from them was a genuine endeavour to do their best. Some really good thinking about why it was important, for example, we were talking about sexual offences, why it was really, really important that they played their basic part in the initial allegation of a rape, or a serious sexual offence, that they kept their head together, thought evidence, displayed those things which says, I believe you, but that doesn't mean I'm not going to investigate you, but I believe you, and I'm going to do my best for you, and I'm going to try my hardest to create that sort of trust and confidence in you as your victim first contact with me, the frontline cop. And there's lots and lots of other stuff will follow afterwards, but I've got a responsibility to do that to the best of my ability. And I saw them talking about that and thinking about that. And here's the bit. I also saw them understand why that was so important. And I sort of contrasted that. I was talking to you earlier, Steve. I sort of contrasted that to what you and I, in our early youth, all those years ago, had experienced when we were probably taught about the same subject, which seemed to me, from my memory of it, here's a series of things you need to do. Otherwise, if you don't do it, excuse my language, you'll drop yourself in shit. Here's a series of things you need to do, because if you don't do it, the organisation will jump all over you. And here is a series of things you need to do, because ultimately, if you make a mess up, everything else goes bandy. And you need to learn these procedures, and you need to learn this route, and we're going to test you out in a couple of these scenarios. We're going to make sure that you say the right things at the right time, and basically you need to leave out of here saying do this, because if you don't, you'll get into trouble. It was far more sophisticated than that, I'm sure, but essentially that was what it was. Whereas actually these young cops are now exposed and thinking about it in much greater depth than ever I did, because they've been invited to do all that sort of stuff, and then also to think, well, why is that important? Why is it, why is the confidence and trust that a victim has in the response they're getting as a service, why is that significant? How does that feed into greater accountability for the police and this notion about policing by consent? Why is it important for the sustainability of the victim to stick with the process through the criminal justice system? Why is it important at all for victims to go through the whole system feeling supported, so when they get to court they're able to give their evidence to the best of their ability, and that's the thing that's going to make a difference about whether an offender gets convicted or not. So all that sort of thinking stuff is things that I didn't have, or maybe I thought about it obliquely, but it certainly wasn't. I wasn't trained in it. My training environment didn't encourage me necessarily to think about that. So I think it's a great leap forward, in one sense, that they are doing it. Of course, the naysayers would say they're doing all this thinking and they're not doing any of the old-fashioned, remember to do this and this and this and this and this. I honestly think there's a space for both, and also the other thing is I think it's responsible on us that are doing the teaching at the university to make sure that we make an intellectual stroke academic exercise, but we also, probably by virtue of who we are and because we're interested in putting our experience back, we also give them an opportunity to say, well, we've been through the mill a few times and we've fallen over a few times, and this is where we fell over, so don't you fall over. So you can do both. So that's a long roundabout way of saying I think the PCDA and the DHEP and all the rest of it, it is early days. I wasn't entirely sure, and I'm still not entirely sure that I completely get it. But, it's probably too early to say whether that is actually making a difference yet, because the cohort of officers who've been through it are still in a relatively early service stage. I think its test will be when those individuals who've been through that process reach the sort of opinion former level within dynamics on frontline policing teams, and then start to cross over into supervisory ranks and start to bring that ethos to the changing the culture, overall culture of the frontline delivery of the organisation. So it's sort of early days really, but it's a step in the right direction. I have heard that there are some forces who have, I don't know whether they've just abandoned the university degree and gone back to IPLDIP. My interpretation was that the law said you can't do that. And the risk around just doing it and saying we're going to train people the old way is great. You can bring it all back into your control and all the rest of it. The trouble is, they're exposing themselves potentially to the risk that says the law defines that people need to be trained in this manner to this standard in this route, and you've taken these people off to do training in a completely different route based entirely on your pragmatism. That's fine until it goes wrong, in the sense that sadly at some point the actions of people who've been trained under this breakaway movement, so to speak, will be subjected to some sort of scrutiny, and when it comes back to them, the training wasn't to the legal, in accordance with the law. That strikes me as quite a dangerous thing to do, and actually it also strikes me as grossly unfair on the cops who you're training to go out in the world with that system. So, the jury's out a bit, just to mix my metaphors a little bit, on whether that sort of breakaway, or we're going to do it this way anyway, will succeed. I think it's all got mixed up with a bit of independence or autonomy of police crime commissioners, and cost, and some frustration about how clunky the university-led system is. I suspect there's a lot of that going on. My experience of people making decisions such as that, in the heat of battle, is probably not a good one, and I do worry a bit for how sustainable that will be. Amen.
Thank you very much for that, Simon, and thanks for all your thoughts and observations. I did ask for some, I did get some, and I hope the listeners got some value from that as well. From my perspective, the report, as you say, is perhaps more than one meal, more than enough to digest in one go, and that's certainly it'll lead to a lot of conversations and a lot of discussion in policing around some of the areas you've talked about and a whole range more. For me, in terms of promotion candidates, I'd encourage you to read it, as Simon alluded to. I don't see a way in which you can't allude to it. There's a lot of information in there, and for me, when I signpost and direct and guide you to materials and things I think might be helpful and useful for you, that's to help you be what I kind of term verbally proactive in your own interests. And it'll be very difficult for you to do that if you get a question on how do you think the Police Foundation report can support you as a newly promoted leader. So there's a whole load of stuff in there. It's free, you can download it. This podcast's free, you can listen to it and re-listen to it. And there's a whole load of stuff on my site that you can download for free as well. YouTube videos, other podcasts and downloadable guides. So wherever you are on your promotion journey, I hope you've enjoyed this third podcast from Simon. Simon, thanks ever so much. I know we're about to depart.
My pleasure, Steve. And let me finish one final piece of advice, really. Picking up on your conclusion, read this damn thing. You know, just it's one of those documents you just simply have to read as a promotion candidate. The one thing I would say to you is if you re-listen, if you could bear it to my babble in the past 40 minutes, I hope you've noticed that I've looked at it from both sides. Never take one view of something like this and just assume that's my view. Always have a bit of, there's bits, and show that you see that there's both sides. The people who wrote this thing have put it out there for debate. Well, debate is when you have conflicting views, or you have debating views, or you decide which view is best. So make sure that when you do read it, you read it with the open mind, and you see some good in it and some bad in it, and then make your own mind up about what it is. And that's just to echo your final thoughts, Steve. That's what will turn you into a person who answers a question about this document. It'll turn you into a good candidate as opposed to an average candidate or even a bad candidate.
Okay, thank you very much. Amen. And I'll be back with another podcast for you shortly. Until then, take care and stay safe.